When you hear the word harem, chances are your mind paints a very familiar picture. Rich rooms bathed in golden light, silk cushions stacked under arched ceilings, and soft music echoing between marble walls. Maybe you imagine women lounging behind latticed screens, their faces half covered, mysterious and still. In the background, the Sultan sits comfortably on a jewel-covered divan, draped in robes, sipping tea, surrounded by beauty and silence. It feels distant, timeless, almost like a dream that doesn't belong to the real world. That image, it's lasted for centuries. It's been printed in history books, whispered in travel guides, and splashed across canvases and movie screens. A polished, aesthetic fantasy of the Ottoman Empire, one that's clean, glamorous, and soaked in luxury. But the truth, that image was designed to be seen, carefully curated, selectively remembered, because behind those velvet curtains and shining floors was something else entirely, something the empire worked very hard to keep hidden. There was another world behind the one you've seen, a system, not of pleasure, but of power, not of beauty, but of structure. And at the center of it all wasn't just women. There were boys. Yes, boys, taken from their homes when they were still young, too young to understand what was happening. Taken from their families, their languages, their faiths, and brought into a palace, not to rest, not to thrive, but to serve. They weren't meant to be remembered. They were meant to disappear in plain sight. These boys didn't choose their fate. They didn't volunteer. They didn't come for opportunity. They were turned into something the empire needed, something it could control. Eunuchs, not by nature, not by belief, but by force. The transformation was brutal, and many never survived it. But those who did, they were reshaped by the palace into quiet, obedient pieces of the imperial machine. And it wasn't random. It was intentional. The empire needed servants who couldn't start dynasties of their own, who had no bloodline, no legacy, no distractions. Their loyalty had to be total, not to a family, not to a people, but to the system. They were trained in silence, taught to manage the most intimate and powerful corners of the court. Some of them would rise, higher than anyone expected. They guarded the inner palace, managed communications, controlled access to the Sultan himself. They worked with the sultanas, the queen mothers, the women who held court power. They held keys, both literal and political. And yet, you won't find their names in most history books. Their lives were erased because they didn't fit the story the empire wanted to tell. No heroism, no bloodlines, no battles. Just obedience, just survival, just shadows moving through marble. But here's the part that matters. The system that created them lasted. It didn't go away when the paintings dried or the stories stopped being told. The harem wasn't just a private garden of desire. It was a place of politics, a calculated, layered institution where every person had a role, and every role had a reason. These boys became part of that machinery, and they were valuable, not in spite of their silence, but because of it. They had no relatives, no outside loyalties, no ambition that couldn't be contained. And so, they were perfect. They survived by learning how to be useful and invisible at the same time. Present everywhere, but never seen. Trusted completely, but never remembered. But when you step back and really look at how the empire functioned, who kept it running, who moved its power, who made its decisions possible, you can't ignore them. They were never meant to be noticed, but they were always there. The empire depended on their silence. But now, finally, we're breaking it. And as we begin this story, take a second. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. These forgotten stories are global now, and seeing how far they reach, how far these buried voices travel, it matters. Because this isn't just about Ottoman history. It's about memory, about power, about what it means to erase people from the past just because they made the story less comfortable. So stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more you'll realize this isn't just about empire. It's about people, and what was taken from them to build someone else's world. In many cases, the path to the palace didn't begin with a royal summons. It began at a market, loud, crowded, and unforgiving. Slave markets in cities like Constantinople, Cairo, and Damascus, where traders shouted over one another. Buyers inspected bodies like merchandise, and agents of the court moved quietly through the crowd, scanning faces like they were shopping for raw materials. And in a way, they were, because this wasn't chaos. It was selection. Ottoman officials knew exactly what they were after. They weren't looking for strength. They weren't looking for grown men. They wanted boys. Young ones, usually under 10 years old. And not just any boys. The ones who stood out. Smooth skin, symmetrical features, delicate frames, long lashes. Beauty wasn't just appreciated, it was currency. And the more refined the boy looked, the higher the price he fetched. Intelligence helped. But appearance, that was the ticket in. Once chosen, these boys didn't walk into a palace. First, they were sent into the shadows. Before they could even step foot in royal corridors, they underwent something so severe, so deliberately erasing, that it changed everything that came after. The process wasn't medical, it wasn't humane, and it wasn't survivable for most. They were castrated, not in clinics or under trained hands, but in dark, makeshift rooms where speed mattered more than skill. No anesthesia, no sterile tools, just pressure, blades, and silence. Sometimes, the person doing it had performed the procedure 100 times. Sometimes, it was their first. And the boys? They had no say, no understanding. Just pain. Survival was a coin flip. Historians estimate that up to 80% of boys didn't make it. They bled out. Infections set in. Their small bodies couldn't handle the trauma. But for the rare few who survived, what came next was just as brutal in its own way. They weren't welcomed. They were isolated, not just to recover, but to forget. Everything. Their names, their languages, their homes. They were stripped of identity, down to the soul. And in its place, the empire built something new. Discipline, obedience, silence. They were wrapped in silk, but not as a reward. It was costume, a signal. Their robes, carefully tailored, lined with gold thread and dyed in specific colors, marked their role. Precious, yes, but owned. Their outfits spoke for them, graceful but restrained, important but never independent. Their names were erased, new ones assigned. Speaking out of turn? Forbidden. Making eye contact with someone too powerful? Risky. Asking questions? Unthinkable. They were taught how to walk, how to bow, how to serve tea without spilling a drop, how to disappear into the architecture when they weren't needed, and how to glide into the room when they were. They studied Islamic law, court etiquette, power dynamics. Their survival depended on being useful, but never threatening. present, but never memorable. And the palace? It wasn't a sanctuary. It wasn't a home. It was a machine. And they weren't residents. They were property. Part 2. The Power and the Paradox. For those who made it, who survived the body-breaking, mind-shaping, soul-erasing path to the palace, there was something waiting at the other end. Not freedom, not peace, but something else. Influence. Because in the heart of the empire, power didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore silk robes and spoke in whispers. The eunuchs, those same boys, now transformed, held keys to the inner kingdom, especially inside the harem. Now let's clear something up. When most people think harem, they imagine a fantasy. Reclining women, perfumed air, soft laughter behind screens. But in reality, the harem was the most politically sensitive wing of the entire Ottoman state. It was where power lived, where alliances were built, where secrets were buried. And who ran it? The eunuchs. They weren't background characters. They were the gatekeepers. They decided who entered and who stayed out, who got access to the royal women, who spoke with the prince, who delivered private letters. They carried the rumors, silenced the threats, and memorized every detail that passed through the palace like human ledgers. They weren't seen, but they saw everything. And among them, one figure towered above the rest, the Kislar Asa, the chief black eunuch. Usually of African origin, Sudanese, Ethiopian, or from the Horn of Africa. He was both feared and trusted. His authority stretched from the women's quarters to the Sultan's private chamber. He oversaw the harem staff, enforced discipline, and reported directly to the throne. He could shape careers, exile rivals, and, according to some accounts, even influence which son of which concubine would one day become Sultan. Think about that. A man with no bloodline, no family, no heirs. Yet he held the future of the dynasty in his hands. All because he mastered the one skill the palace valued most: controlled invisibility. The eunuchs were the empire's most complex paradox. They had no traditional power, yet they held absolute access. They weren't free, yet they influenced the fate of rulers. They were erased from stories, yet essential to the system. They were shadows that held the strings, and while history forgot their names, this story won't. On paper, they were nobodies. Legally, they were property, stripped of names, rights, and futures. No inheritance, no last name, no family to fall back on. And yet, inside the palace, they moved like ghosts in command. Their steps echoed through marble corridors, and with a simple nod, doors opened. Doors even high-ranking viziers hesitated to approach. They arranged secret weddings, organized intelligence networks, and, according to whispered records, even ordered quiet eliminations. All of it done with calm faces, lowered eyes, and a silence more powerful than any shout. But even with all that responsibility, some of it immense, one truth never changed. They were never free. They couldn't marry, couldn't raise children, couldn't go home, even if they remembered what home meant. Their identities had been torn away and rebuilt by the empire's will. What remained wasn't a person in the usual sense, but a tool, carefully shaped, highly trained, and permanently controlled. Even at the height of influence, they were never seen as whole. They were functional, valuable, but never truly human in the eyes of the system. And the higher they climbed, the colder it got. They were praised for loyalty, rewarded for obedience, but rarely remembered. Their names didn't make it into history books. They signed no laws, left no children to carry their stories forward. No monuments were built for them, no legacy carved in stone. They were the machinery behind the empire's greatness, moving parts that could never stop, but were never meant to be noticed. That was the price of being trusted in the palace. You got close to power, but only by giving up everything that made you a person. Part 3. What really happened behind the palace walls. When most people picture the Ottoman Harem, they see beauty, domes lined with gold, cushions in every shade of red and blue, jasmine-scented fountains, and women walking slowly through sunlight and shadows. It looks like a fantasy, soft, still, luxurious. But the harem wasn't built for comfort. It was built for control. Beneath the layers of art and elegance, it worked like a machine. One designed not for romance, but for strategy. Not for dreams, but for empire. And in that mechanism, boys weren't the main characters. They were gears. Many of the boys who entered the palace never became powerful. They didn't manage secrets or influence royal decisions. Instead, they worked in silence. They stood in corners. They blended into backgrounds. But they kept the harem running. They poured tea, smoothed rugs, lit lamps, served at dinners without speaking, waited on the Sultan and his sons, followed the women of the court from one marble room to another, always watching, always ready. Their outfits sparkled, silk robes, jeweled belts, perfect shoes, but none of it was theirs. It was decoration. A costume meant to remind everyone that they didn't belong. They weren't family. They weren't guests. They were display pieces. Furniture with orders. And if one of them resisted, if he slipped up, said too much, looked too long, asked a question, he was dealt with. Not loudly, not dramatically, but efficiently. Replaced, transferred, forgotten. Because the machine didn't wait. It didn't care. There was always another boy ready to step in. That's what made it terrifying. It worked too well. The system didn't rely on individuals. It relied on silence, on obedience, on making people forget who they were before they entered the gate. No names were written down. No letters saved, no tombs marked. These boys became invisible by design. Their presence was everywhere. Their memory was nowhere. And yet, without them, the palace would have fallen apart. The harem wasn't a secret pleasure garden. It was a center of power. Every role inside it had a political function. Every figure had purpose. And these boys? They weren't ornaments. They were the glue, the messengers, the workers, the ones who held the structure together by sacrificing everything of their own. Some of them rose, became gatekeepers, organizers, trusted hands of queens and princes. They mastered politics the only way they could, quietly, strategically. They never overstepped, never spoke out. But they learned how to survive, and in rare cases, how to climb. But even then, freedom never came. No families, no personal legacy, no chance to leave the palace, even if they'd earned it 1,000 times over. Their old names were gone. Their futures belonged to the empire. They weren't men. They were functions. And the rest? Most of them disappeared without a sound. No graves, no goodbyes, no stories passed down. Their pain, their labor, their entire lives, folded into the palace floor, sealed behind doors that were never meant to be opened again. The story of the harem isn't just about silk pillows, golden trays, and whispered romance in candlelit rooms. That's the version we've all heard. The version sold in paintings, movies, and tourist brochures. But behind the fantasy lies a deeper, more difficult truth. One built not on pleasure, but on power, and not on love, but on control. Because the real history of the Ottoman Harem is a story about fear, about silence, about losing your name, your past, and sometimes even your sense of self. For centuries, the imperial harem inside Istanbul's Topkapi Palace was the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't just a luxurious private world, it was a political powerhouse. Behind its marble courtyards and gilded doors lived not only royal consorts and sultanas, but also hundreds of others: attendants, guards, teachers, and above all, eunuchs. And among them were boys. Young, quiet, disciplined. Boys who didn't arrive by choice. These boys, often taken from the far edges of the empire, from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and parts of North and East Africa, were brought to the palace not to be raised as sons, but as servants. Most came from non-Muslim backgrounds and were subjected to religious conversion, training, and total isolation from their previous lives. Their languages were stripped away, their names replaced, their future rewritten. Eunuchs, many of them black Africans from Sudan or Abyssinia, became the backbone of the palace system. The most powerful among them, known as the Kisler Asa, or chief black eunuch, held the keys to the Sultan's private world. He controlled access to the women of the harem. He managed internal security, delivered secret messages, and sometimes even shaped imperial succession behind the scenes. His power was enormous, but it came at a cost. Personal freedom was gone. Family life was forbidden, and loyalty was demanded always, without question. But not everyone in that system rose so high. Most remained shadows, silent witnesses to the empire's highs and lows. They watched princes grow into rulers. They saw sultans fall, sometimes poisoned, sometimes overthrown. They watched palace intrigues play out like silent storms. They carried messages, poured drinks, straightened garments, always nearby, never included. They lived right next to the seat of absolute power, and yet they never truly had a place within it. And that is what makes this story so haunting. Because these people weren't just extras in the background of history, they were essential to how the palace worked. Without them, the system would have collapsed. But their voices were never preserved. Their stories were rarely written down. Their names faded from records almost as quickly as their lives passed. Today, we remember the sultans. We remember the battles, the architecture, the grandeur. But the ones who kept the palace running, the ones who held the secrets, endured the silence, and served the throne without ever being seen. They were erased, intentionally, quietly, but not anymore. Because today, we're telling their story, the story of the harem's shadows, the ones who watched, endured, and remained unseen. The ones who lived behind the curtains, not just as servants, but as silent survivors. Their history deserves more than a footnote, and it's time the world remembered them.